watercolor pencil, watercolor marker. I'm going to show you a little bit how those work. So I went ahead and stamped an image on this page, and I'm going to use the watercolor pencils and the watercolor markers and show you how those work with this. And when you're stamping in your Bible, and especially if you're going to do watercolor over the top, you have to use a permanent pigment watercolor waterproof, that's the word I'm looking for, waterproof stamp pad. And so stays on absolutely whatever you stamp on, it will stay on. Slippery surfaces, metal, plastic, the Bible pages, and it does bleed through, so you have to pre-treat the page. I like this VersaFine. It is made for very fine stamps like the one I stamped here with the little tiny raindrops. It gets the fine detail the way the ink is formulated so that you can use it with very detailed stamps. And then this is just a Craftsmart pad, and it's a pigment pad, and it doesn't say that it's waterproof, but I have a test page in the back of my Bible, and so if you ever want to look at the test page and see what products I've tested back there, I think I used the weights and measures page in the back of the Bible to try different pens and paint and stamp pads to see what bleeds, and then on the other side of the page I stamped it, let it dry completely, and then took a water brush over it to see how waterproof it is. So those are three that work. Again, you have to let them dry completely before you start working your watercolor over, or they will smudge, and that's not fun. Same with pens too. If you're drawing something and then painting, a lot of times I'll do the watercolor first and then I'll do the lettering over the top. Okay, so first with the watercolor pencils, pick a color here. So there's a couple different ways you can do this. You can color directly on the page, and I'm not holding my pencil well because I don't want my hand in the way for you to see. So this may not be very exact, but that's okay. We're all just trying to get the point here. So I'm just kind of coloring around the polka dots on her skirt, laying down some color, and of course the more intensely I color or press and layers I go over, the darker the color will be when I add water to it, but because the water is going to dilute and make it a little more translucent. So coloring first, this is this technique, coloring first, and then my tiny brush, here we go. So for these fine details I'm going to use a smaller brush, so then I can just kind of go in and whoop, and just dab some water in there, get it to react, and then you have more of a watercolor paint look, but it might be easier to lay the color down if you like to color more than you like to paint. I don't know. It looks pretty cool to me. Okay, now let me show you the difference with the same pencil. I'm going to take my pencil and I'm going to dip it in the water. And this is just another way you can use watercolor paints. And let's see, maybe I'll do her apron. So you see how much more intensely the color lays down when the tip is wet? As soon as it starts drying up, it's back to looking more like a pencil. And I'm just kind of doing the edges and her folds. Okay? And I can let that dry a little bit, or I can go in right away and spread it out. Kind of leave some of that darker for accent on her little folds. If I feel like I took off too much, I can go back in with the pencil again on the wet. Just so you get, it's very, very you barely have to touch it and it just feels like it's melting into the page, which is really fun and cool. So those are watercolor pencils. So I wanted to show you now the watercolor brush markers, and this set is available from Michaels. It's an Artist Loft brand. Tombow makes watercolor brush markers. Kuretake, Gonzi Tombi makes watercolor brush markers. Both of those would be more of an artist grade, where these are student grade, but they work very well for me. So let me just show you a little bit here on another stamped image, just like the one I used in the watercolor pencil tutorial. I'm going to do a very similar process here, in that I'm just going to use the tip to just kind of fill in along the shaded areas in the stamp and along the edges to give it some contrast and kind of leave the center white for highlight. So you could just color directly on here like you were using a colored pencil, but I do the outline and then I use a watercolor brush to activate the pen and just get it moving around on the page a little bit. Might have gotten a little bit too much water on there, so I can just dab it off a little if I feel like it's too much. There we go. And I can even pull off some of the color to get in here into some of the background of the umbrella as well. So that's kind of how that works. You'll notice that when I color with this, I'm keeping the tip at an angle, if you can see, but I want to keep that brush tip really a sharp, fine point, so I'm not going to be pushing, you know, directly down on the tip like this when I'm coloring with it. The main reason I got the watercolor brush markers, although they are fun to color with, my main purpose around it was for brush lettering, and I've been sort of practicing and starting to learn some of that. And you want that fine tip so you can do these really fine lines on your upstrokes and then the heavier line on your downstroke, sort of like this. And that's a whole nother tutorial. But you get that kind of brush lettering effect. So I want to take really good care of my tips for that. The nice thing about the watercolor brush markers is you can do some tip-to-tip mixing of color. So here I have my yellow, and if I wanted a lighter shade of green, I could just color a little bit of the blue onto that yellow marker, and then I could come in and color with the green. And then when I am done with that green, and you can see it's kind of turning back to yellow again as the green wears out, and that's also how you would clean it, would just be to scribble until that green is not showing anymore. And obviously I wouldn't do that on my main artwork, but since this is my practice page, I'm just going to scribble away here until I can show you it's all clean. The green is all gone. Oh, one little spot, but pretty much gone off of there. You can also use that effect to do grading of color too. And like, say I was filling in a leaf and I wanted the leaf to go from a dark green to a light green, I could do that. In fact, let me show you that on our next technique, which is using the watercolor markers on a stamp. So this is a fill-in fine line stamp. This stamp that I have here is a solid stamp, and you can actually use the watercolor markers just to color directly on a stamp like this. And so I'm going to use the leaves just to show you that graded with my little bit of blue on the yellow there. I have a green, and I'm just going to start on this end and just keep moving it along till I have most of that green off of there. And then I'll clean my tip again to get the green out. And I'm not too concerned about this drying while I'm messing with my brush, because I'll show you a little trick. So to give the stamped image more of a watercolor effect, let's see, to give it a little more of a watercolor effect, I'm going to actually spritz a little bit of water on there before I stamp it. And then it'll take that watercolor and get it activated from the tip of the marker, and it should give me a sort of a watercolor effect on the stamped image. So you can see that there, and you can hopefully see that the color is graded. I'm afraid if I get a lot closer I may just be showing it out of focus, but hopefully you can see there that the color goes from a darker green to a lighter yellow on the leaves. Okay, so another technique, if you don't want to do the tip to tip technique, you can actually just color with the pen on the stamp. And let me wipe this off real quick so we can start over with fresh color. So maybe you want to just do it there on the shadow. And then I can come in with a little bit different green to do the rest of the leaf. Just coloring directly onto the stamp, filling it in. Okay, and I'm going to give it another little spritz. And the further away, the less water, obviously, and the closer I am, the more water. So depending on how defined you want your print versus how watercolory you want your print, this really technical term there, watercolory. Anyway, I'll show you one more on this one. So for this one, I'm going to try and do 3 colors. So I'm going to use the yellow to color the petals. And then I'll go in, once I get around, with a second color on the petals. So let's do like a really yellow orange. And I'm just going to come in and kind of do that at the base of each of the petals. Add a little bit of that. All the way around. Okay, and then on here. I'm going to get a brown, and I'm going to do the center and these little dots in brown. So again, just using the side of my brush so I'm not smashing my tip, and just putting it on there. And then I'm going to get my water again and give it a little spritz. And you can buy these little bottles. I had mentioned earlier in one of the other tutorials, these little bottles are for sale, misters. But this happened to be one that came with a phone screen protector, and so I just hung on to it, and it's a very handy little thing. Okay, so now I spritzed it, now I'm gonna give it a stamp. And so you see, got that. And that came out pretty crisp. I didn't use a lot of water on that. I could, you can see it kind of has a water drop effect on there. If I were to add more water, it would probably have even more of a watercolor run, or I can come back in with a wet brush and I can kind of push that color around more if I want to. So the watercolor markers are very reactive to water, sort of like we talked about the watercolors, Distress inks being very reactive, and each watercolor product is reactive in a different way as to whether it starts moving again off the page, the color off the page when you add water after it has dried.